And you're listening to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. We now turn to a conversation about the history of Taiwan and the history of China. My guest is Valerie Hanson. Valerie Hanson is the Stanley Woodward Professor of History at Yale University, where she teaches Chinese and world history. She is the author of a number of books, including The Silk Road, A New History, and The Open Empire. Her latest book is called The Year 1000, When Explorers Connected the World and Globalization Began. We had her on to talk about that book just a few months ago. Valerie Hanson, it's a great pleasure to welcome you back to this radio program.
Mitch, it's a pleasure to be back.
What's the latest? What's the oldest history we know about Taiwan and its relationship to China?
That's interesting. I can think of things written in the Sung Dynasty. I can think of a book in 1225, and there may be things earlier. Even though Taiwan is so close to China, it's difficult to get to from China. The currents are not that easy, and it was originally inhabited by not Chinese people, but Austronesians, people who spoke like the ancestors of Malaysian and Polynesian. And the key reason Taiwan stayed isolated for so long was that they were headhunters. They were kind of famous headhunters. And so many of the people who went to Taiwan didn't come back.
And so what more can you tell me about the Austronesians, I guess who we would consider the original inhabitants of Taiwan? And are there still Austronesians in Taiwan today?
Yeah, I don't know that they would self-identify as Austronesians, but for example, there are different indigenous groups of indigenous peoples, and one of them is Paiwan, P-A-I-W-A-N. The indigenous peoples are about 2.3% of the population of Taiwan, which is around 24 million.
Does China have a history? What's China's history then in Taiwan?
Well, I was going to say the first foreign power that has a history in Taiwan, which is, I think, interesting and a little bit surprising, is the Netherlands. So the first foreign power that governs Taiwan is in the 1600s. The Dutch take Taiwan, and they don't control the whole island, but they have a fort there, a trading fort, and Taiwan is a major exporter of deer skins, and that was a very valuable commodity at the time. And then Taiwan was independent for a little while. There was a ruler who was a mixed Chinese and Japanese descent, and he ruled. And then the Chinese defeat that independent ruler, whose name is Koxinga, in 1683, and that's the official start date for when the Chinese are in Taiwan.
And this is the Qing dynasty?
It's the Qing dynasty, exactly.
What's important?
I was just going to say that from 1683 to 1874, Taiwan is under a quarantine, meaning that people from China are not supposed to go to Taiwan. They do. There's a lot of migration from the nearby provinces, so mostly Fujian, to the west coast of Taiwan. And we have some maps from the 18th century that were like state-of-the-art maps that were done by some French advisors to the Chinese emperor. And they show the west coast of Taiwan pretty clearly in all the names of the towns. And then the middle and the east coast is completely blank because that's where the indigenous peoples live. And the Chinese have no control there.
What's important to know about the Qing dynasty?
If you've never heard about it, it was ruled from 1644 to 1911, so it's the last dynasty in Chinese history. The emperors were Manchu. They were from northeast China. They weren't Chinese, and they created a very large empire. And I'd say a lot of the problems that China has today, challenges it faces, come from that very large empire. The Qing made China much bigger, so they took Taiwan, but they also took Xinjiang and Tibet, Mongolia, northeastern China. And so, and historically, it was possible for this is not just true of the Qing, it's true of lots of historic empires. There were different categories of territory. There were some places that were ruled directly, but there were some places that were kind of peripheral areas where the center didn't pay too much attention. And in the 21st century, and even in the 20th century, we don't have those categories anymore. You're either in a country or you're not in a country. And so Taiwan was a peripheral area under the Qing for a long time, up till about 1874.
That's very interesting. So the complexities of having a large empire.
Right. And one of the, this is something Chinese historians often talk about, is the transition from empire to nation, right? Everybody who lives in China is a citizen of the People's Republic of China. But historically, some people who lived in China were, they weren't citizens. They were subjects of the Qing emperor. I guess from the emperor's point of view, he might have said everybody was his subject, but he had much more control over some people than he did over others.
Yeah. And I guess that would be a product of also a 200 plus year dynasty or empire in which you have different leaders making different deals to maintain this dynasty or empire. Yeah. So at the very beginning then, in the late 1600s, you have sort of Chinese influence on just a portion of the island, which we now know as Taiwan. What would happen after that?
Well, what's interesting is there's a big change in the 1860s and the 1870s and it involves, remember, the headhunters, right? They're a big theme in Taiwanese history. But in 1867, a U.S. ship is wrecked on the southeast coast of Taiwan. So that's the indigenous part, the headhunting part. And the headhunters capture the captain, his wife, and 12 sailors and murder them. And one sailor survives and crosses from Taiwan to China, goes to a city called now Xiamen, which was historically called Amoy. And the Americans had a consul there and says the Taiwan should, compensate, not Taiwan, says the Qing should compensate America for the loss of our ship and the murder of the captain and his wife and the crew. And the Chinese government says we have no control over those Aborigines. That is beyond our control. That is a place beyond our control. And then a couple years later, in 1871, there's a Japanese shipwreck. And this same thing happens, but this time 50 Japanese are captured and killed. And Japan demands compensation. They send an army to Taiwan. And the Qing then says Taiwan is part of the empire. So, in some ways you could start the relationship between China and Taiwan in 1874. And that's when the Qing start to directly govern Taiwan, in the sense that they send a governor there, and he doesn't control the whole area. He has much better control of the West than he does of the East. But that's like officially when, the Qing is taking responsibility for Taiwan, and they declare a formal province in 1887. So, this is all sort of technicalities, but it just shows that, or it seems like technicalities, but it just shows that Taiwan, even though when you look at a map, it looks so close to China, it really was on the periphery. It was not an area of central concern.
During this period of time, are more people migrating from mainland China to Taiwan?
So the proportion of Chinese people living on Taiwan is always increasing. And like in 1750, it's like 50-50. So by the 1870s, I don't know, I'm guessing maybe it's 80% Chinese.
Is that causing problems on the island itself? Is this a smooth process, or is there ruptures? Is there, often
I think there's
genocide?
I wouldn't use the word genocide. I would just say that the Chinese are the West Coast is more is more agricultural and can absorb the Chinese settlers. The East Coast is still under the control of these different indigenous groups. And yes, there are conflicts between the two groups.
Yeah. Now, Taiwan, it's almost, is it equal distance between China and Japan?
That's, I was sitting here thinking I should have checked before I talked to you. I don't know.
But roughly speaking, though, I mean,
I would say it's much closer to China than it is to Japan.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, between Taiwan and Japan is Okinawa. Right. So
we'd have a war between China and Japan, in 1895?
Right.
This would have a major impact on Taiwan. Tell me about the War of I guess they call it the Sino-Japanese War of 1895. What's important to know about that?
It's funny because it's one of the wars that you study when you're looking at Japanese history and the rise of Japan. Japan has, starting in the 1860s, launched this modernization campaign. It has a modern army and a modern navy. And I don't know, on the East Coast, we say Sino-Japanese. Going into the war, people were not sure who would win because China is such a big country compared to Japan. But the Japanese won a major battle early on in the war, and then a peace was brokered, and the price that they exacted from the Chinese, they asked for a piece of territory. They asked for Taiwan, and the Qing government gave them sovereignty of Taiwan. So Taiwan became a Japanese colony for 50 years. So that's very important in terms of like the island's identity, that between 1895 and 1945, it was under Japanese rule. People in Taiwan were learning Japanese, and it was really separate from China. I remember reading a memoir by a Taiwanese man who goes to Shanghai in like the 1940s, before 1945, and he's shocked by how much people in Shanghai hate Taiwan. They because of World War II, the Chinese are on the Allied side against the Axis, right, against Japan and Germany, and people in China just think the Taiwanese are like traitors, that they are supporting the Japan war effort. So, and there's big cultural differences, like linguistically, people in Taiwan are speaking. So there are the indigenous languages that are related to Austronesian languages, Malaysian and Polynesian. That's a very small percent. But people are not speaking Mandarin. They're speaking the dialect of Fujian province or the dialect of Guangzhou province. And everybody in school is learning Japanese. Japanese is the language of education.
Still spoken today by a lot of people?
Not so. It's kind of dying out now. I mean, I was a student in Taiwan in the late 70s and the early 80s. And at that point, elderly people reliably spoke Japanese.
Still spoke Japanese. Yeah, that's interesting.
And not Mandarin, right? So like in a lot of ways, Taiwan is it's a formative experience to be under Japanese rule. And then I was going to say, should we keep going historically to the end of World War II?
Yeah. I mean, we'll get into all of it. And I have other questions, but yeah.
Okay. So World War II ends 1945, and Japan's empire is dismantled, right? Every place that Japan had control of, and the main places in the empire were Korea, Taiwan, and Northeast China. And the Japanese are all repatriated from those places. And all of those places are, returned if they were owned by some other larger entity, or they're given independence. And so and in the case of Taiwan, it is returned to the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek that's been in power since about 1927. And so there's a period from 1945 to 49, where Taiwan is governed by the nationalists. The nationalists lose control of all of China in 1949. The communists take over. They announced the founding of the People's Republic on October 1st, 1949. And the nationalists retreat to Taiwan. And I think one of the reasons the situation today is so complicated is that the communists control they control most of China, all of China, except for Taiwan, but they maintain a claim to all of China and Taiwan. But so do the nationalists who are on Taiwan. They claim that both sides, the communists and the nationalists, both claim to represent one China. And they both assert that there's only one China. That includes all of mainland China and Taiwan. And so October 1st, 1949, the communists take over in China, and they certainly planned to go to Taiwan. That was their hope, to conquer Taiwan and get rid of the nationalists. But the Korean War intervenes. Mao Zedong's son is killed. And after the war ends, just seems like people don't have the stomach. People in China don't have the stomach for more war. And so Taiwan continues as under a nationalist government, and China continues under the communist government.
Is Mao's son killed in the Korean War?
Yep.
And that's a major event.
Well, I don't know if it's, I think it's when we're trying to explain why the Chinese didn't conquer Taiwan, I think that's a factor, a contributing factor. They tried. You can go, there's islands off of, the geography is interesting. You can take a hydrofoil from Xiamen, which is in Fujian province, for about an hour and get to a little island called Jinmen, which used to be called Quemoy. There was the Quemoy and Matsu incident under President Kennedy. And so those are pieces of Taiwan that are very, very close to Fujian, to China, to the People's Republic.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Valerie Hanson. Valerie Hanson is a Stanley Woodward Professor of History at Yale University, where she teaches Chinese and world history. And we are in conversation about the history of both Taiwan and China and their relationship. I want to go back a little bit in time, back to the Qing dynasty. This is the dynasty that would first, for China, start to administer Taiwan in the late 17th century. It's with the fall of the Qing dynasty. The Qing dynasty would fall in 1911. I think right. This is significant because this would bring big changes to China, along with the Japanese-Chinese War. That would also set the groundwork and understanding what would happen in the years to follow between Taiwan and China.
Yes.
What happens after the Qing dynasty falls? And what forces it to fall?
Well, there's a rebellion, and the Qing are unable to put the rebellion down, kind of a mutiny, a military mutiny. But the Qing dynasty has been falling for 50 years, right? And it's been in power for 250 years. So it's, in a simple way, you could say modernity causes it to fall. That it's a government that is no longer able to face the challenges of rule in the early 20th century. But there's and the empire breaks apart. There's basically the Qing is succeeded by a group of warlords in different parts of China, and China is not unified. In 1927, the Nationalist Party is one of, and it gets very complicated, but I was going to say the Nationalist Party is one of multiple players in Chinese history between 1911 and 1949. And they're, in 1927, they form a nominal Republic of China, which is really an alliance of different warlords who support Chiang Kai-shek, right? He's the leader who takes power. And he's the leader that the U.S. is allied with in World War II. There
are times when the communist and nationalist are united as well. Isn't that correct?
Right. And
It's
so
a complicated history between those two.
It is a very complicated history. And there's periods of time when, I mean, the Comintern, based in Moscow, is often supporting the nationalists and not the communists. So there are, I was going to say, there are some periods called United Fronts when the nationalists and the communists are unified, and then there are periods where they're openly opposed to each other, and all-out civil war breaks out in 1945 at the end of World War II. And so the communists and the nationalists are fighting with each other, and the communists prevail. There's a lot of corruption on the part of the nationalists, and the communists basically just do a better job of gaining support in rural China.
That's the difference?
I would just say, yes, that's like the main reason that the communists prevail. And then one of the things that's interesting about the nationalists, so the nationalists have been in power in China. I mean, the party goes back to Sun Yat-sen. It goes back to 1911 and even before 1911, the end of the Qing dynasty. But when the nationalists move to Taiwan, they change a lot. They become much less corrupt. They institute land reform on Taiwan. And so that's one of the things if the nationalists had behaved earlier in China the way they did in Taiwan, they might not have been overthrown. They are they're a much more effective and much more reform-minded government on Taiwan than they ever were in China.
Sun Yat-sen, this is an important figure. Even with the communists, he's considered the father of modern day China. Right.
And he's one of the opponents of the Qing dynasty. He's an interesting person. He is overseas Chinese. He's from Hong Kong. He studies to be a doctor. He raises a lot of money in Hong Kong. Excuse me, not Hong Kong, Hawaii. He goes around Hawaii raising money. And he has a philosophy. He talks about the three people's principles. And these concepts are, and I'm sitting here, am I going to be able to tell you what the three people's principles are? One of them is people's government, which is the word for democracy in Chinese. And so the communists support, claim Sun Yat-sen as a very important figure for them, and so do the nationalists.
They both stem from him. At one point, they were all under Sun Yat-sen before he dies.
Yeah. Well, I would say his teachings were malleable enough that people who had very different views could still both claim to be inheritors of Sun Yat-sen's mantle.
Was he able to keep sort of the movement unified?
No. And he never really governed. He was always he was better at kind of rallying the masses and giving speeches and fundraising than he was at governance.
After the communists defeat the national, in my understanding, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, because my grip on this history is not very firm, but it was the nationalists who would first start sort of persecuting the communists in China. Is that accurate?
Well, yeah, the nationalists this is a party trying to gain control and who see the communists as a threat. The communists are a very small group. They're funded by the Soviets. So you could say the nationalists. They were suppressing any sources of opposition that they could. And I was going to say, but they weren't that powerful. The nationalists it's not a very, as I said, it's this coalition of different warlords. It's not a very strong government.
But the communists were themselves a very small group.
The communists start off very small. When they're founded, there's 20 people at the founding. Right. So, and then, the communists only get bigger. In the 1930s, they go on the Long March, and they are up in the North China, in a very poor part of North China. And then World War II is already underway. It starts earlier in China than it does in America. Like 1937, Japan is already attacking it. The communists, one of the reasons that they're able to rise is that they argue persuasively they are a better counter to Japan than the nationalists. That their army is stronger. So, when you look at writing from the 40s, and a lot of intellectuals supported the communists, not everything that they proposed, but just that they saw them as less corrupt and more competent than the nationalists.
When the nationalists go to Taiwan after being defeated by the communists, what happens to the people who are already in Taiwan?
Well, there's I don't know the population of Taiwan at that time, but there are about 1 million people go from China, and I don't know, let's guess and say it's around 10 million, 15 million, and they are not consulted. There are no elections, right? They've had 50 years of Japanese colonial rule, non-democratic rule, and the nationalists arrive. And initially, I think there's a lot of optimism about the Japanese being gone and having a Chinese government. And then there's something called the February 27th incident when and I told you already about the language problems, that the nationalists are speaking Mandarin, Chinese, and other dialects, but people in Taiwan don't really know Mandarin. They know Japanese. There's an altercation, a woman who is selling cigarettes, an elderly woman, and the nationalist soldiers, I think, want her to confiscate her cigarettes and say that she needs to pay taxes to the nationalist tobacco tax. But that triggers a riot like through the whole island. And there's a huge effort to suppress the riot and suppress opposition to the nationalists. A lot of left-leaning Taiwanese are disappeared. And we now know killed. And there's been, since the nationalists declare martial law I don't know if they declared it in 47, but during the February 27th, the suppression, there's certainly martial law. They may declare it in 45, they may declare it in 47, and it's only in 1987 that they lift martial law. And it's really only since after the year 2000 that historians have worked on these people and figured out there's a museum in Taiwan you can go to and see all the names of the people who died in this 227 incident.
So about 40 years. Taiwan is
40 years of martial law.
Yeah. Well, who are these leftists that are disappearing, and are they communists themselves, or?
They're not members of the Chinese Communist Party. These are kind of Taiwan intellectuals. Some of them have studied in Japan. They're drawn to Marxist teachings, and I was going to say they might have been if let's say in 1945 Taiwan was the Japanese left Taiwan and the nationalists, no one from China had gone to Taiwan. These might have been the people who would have led this new country of Taiwan. But the nationalists went in 1945, right? And they suppressed all of the indigenous, I'm sorry, I've been using indigenous for these Austronesian speakers, but the Taiwanese people who spoke, we call it Taiwanese in English, but it's related to Fujian dialect. So people who speak a dialect of Chinese, these people are all basically kept out of the government. The nationalists, if you think of a government that was big enough to rule all of China, moves to Taiwan, there's not many positions for the Taiwanese. The nationalists, the people from the mainlanders, fill all the positions and take over the government, and there's no plebiscite or there's no consultation of any kind with people living in Taiwan.
Is this all from the direction of Chiang Kai-shek?
Yes.
Is he the ultimate ruler?
Yeah, he's the head of the nationalists.
Yeah.
And then when he dies, his son takes over, a man named Jiang Jingguo, and he continues a lot of his dad's policies. And then he's the one who lifts martial law in 1987. So in a lot of ways, he's a kind of a hero of Taiwan's history in the sense of lifting the repression and putting into place. Taiwan is a democracy now, and It starts to become a democracy when martial law is lifted in 1987, and the first direct presidential elections are held in 1996. So Taiwan's been a democracy for less than 30 years.
What leads to the lifting of martial law? Is there a people's movement?
Well, there's some. Yes, I mean, there's some calling for. There's some protests. There's some riots. There's some strikes that are put down. But there's also, I think, Jiang Jingguo realizing that maybe the time has come to stop this kind of strong arm rule.
Tell me about President Lee Teng-hui.
Well, he's the first person who's elected to office, right? Right. I mean, I was going to say, going back to Shanghai Shek, there probably are elections under the nationalists. All right, but no elections are held from 47 to 1987. So Lee Teng-hui is he's Taiwanese. His parents are not mainlanders. I mean, his parents are local people, local Chinese people who came from Qing, China. I don't know when they came. I'm guessing 200 years earlier.
But not yet, not with the nationalists.
No, earlier, for the waves of migration we were talking about, of people just going to Taiwan as a place where they could maybe make their fortunes. And he's a member of the Nationalist Party. So there was when the political system forms in the early 1990s, the Nationalist Party is the ruling power. They continue. And then there's an opposition party. It was funny, when I was a student in Taiwan, the word for the opposition was people outside the Nationalist Party. They didn't even have a name. It was just like there was the Nationalist Party, and then there were the people outside the Nationalist Party. And so Lee Teng-hui he's a supporter of the nationalists. And the nationalists adjust to the presence of democracy. Elections are held from 47 to 1987. So Lee Teng-hui he's Taiwanese. His parents are not mainlanders. I mean, his parents are local people, local Chinese people who came from Qing, China. I don't know when they came. I'm guessing 200 years earlier.
But not yet, not with the nationalists.
No, earlier, for the waves of migration we were talking about, of people just going to Taiwan as a place where they could maybe make their fortunes. And he's a member of the Nationalist Party. So there was when the political system forms in the early 1990s, the Nationalist Party is the ruling power. They continue. And then there's an opposition party. It was funny, when I was a student in Taiwan, the word for the opposition was people outside the Nationalist Party. They didn't even have a name. It was just like there was the Nationalist Party, and then there were the people outside the Nationalist Party. And so Lee Teng-hui he's a supporter of the nationalists. And the nationalists adjust to the presence of democracy. And so now in Taiwan, there's two big parties, the nationalists, and then the Democratic People's Party, the DPP. And the DPP is more in favor of Taiwan independence than the nationalists. And the nationalists still officially think that there's one China, right? So go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, it reminded me, for many years at the beginning in the 20th century, the world recognized Taiwan as being the leaders, right, of China,
right,
including the United Nations.
Right. And so that all changes in the 1970s, right, with Nixon's visit to China. And then, everything, all the positions that the nationalists in Taiwan had, those are all given to the communists in China. and the nationalists are kicked off all of. So, originally the groups were not representative because they had the nationalists and not the communists. Then they change, and then they have the communists but not the nationalists. So that's why, like, Taiwan is not a member of the UN, and right, it's not. I think it's not a member of WHO. There's a big controversy about that. But all of these international entities all basically accept this premise that there's one China, and maybe it's communist China, and maybe it's a nationalist China. But I think one of the reasons it's so complicated, this political situation is so complicated today, is that hardly anybody says Taiwan is not part of China.
That is interesting. The bigger question is who is, and I think we all understand today who rules China, mainland China. It's pretty clear, but nonetheless, the question is, as you said, the nationalists in Taiwan still think they are the true rulers of China.
I wonder if the nationalists. I think there's such a big difference between people's official positions and then the acknowledgement of reality. And like the president of Taiwan.
Read The Open Empire as I express my interest in learning more about the history of China, and I will do that. Her latest book, which we had her on a few months ago to talk about, is called The Year 1000, When Explorers Connected the World and Globalization Began. Valerie Hanson, I found that very educational, and I thank you for taking this time to join me today.
Oh, it was my pleasure. It's always fun to talk to you. We didn't go off script as much as usual.
Next time.
Next time.
That does it for Letters on Politics. The show is produced by Deanna Martinez. Kirsten Thomas is our engineer. If you'd like to hear this or past shows, you could do so by going online and finding our archives at kpfa.org. I'm Mitch Jeserich, and I thank you for listening.